James Miller had always been an ordinary man, quiet and unassuming, and yet on a single Tuesday, he turned Cedarville upside down. By noon, he had made over 100 calls to 911, and by the end of the day, the town had been terrorized by 372 relentless rings. No one could understand why or what he might do next. It was a seemingly ordinary Tuesday in Cedarville, a small town where life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The streets were quiet. The sun cast warm light on brick houses and neatly trimmed lawns, and the local 911 center hummed along with its usual rhythm. Operators handled routine calls, minor traffic accidents, barking dogs, small fires, but nothing out of the ordinary ever shook the calm of the town. That calm would not last. Around mid-morning, a strange pattern began to emerge. One of the operators noticed a call coming in from the same number over and over. At first, it was easy to ignore. People accidentally dial numbers all the time. But soon the calls became frequent, almost relentless. Each one lasted only a few seconds, filled with static and indistinct sounds, leaving the operators puzzled. They tried to call back, but there was no answer. By noon, the number had called over 50 times. Operators exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the repetition felt deliberate. It wasn't an accident. Someone was intentionally making these calls. The staff attempted to trace the number, hoping to understand who or what was behind it. While the technical team worked, the calls continued, filling the phones with more noise and distraction. As the day progressed, the pace intensified. By mid-afternoon, the number had rung in more than 100 times. Officers in the field began reporting delays, unable to respond promptly to legitimate emergencies. Residents started noticing slower ambulance arrivals and police response times, though they did not yet know why. The operators at the center were growing frustrated. Each call interrupted the normal workflow, leaving real emergencies hanging in the queue. By evening, the situation reached a breaking point. The number had called 372 times in a single day, an unprecedented flood that overwhelmed the 911 system. Phones rang constantly, red lights blinked on the console, and operators struggled to keep up. Every attempt to silence or block the number failed. Cedarville, a town that prided itself on safety and close-knit community support, found itself paralyzed by this invisible threat. Authorities realized they were facing more than a prank. The dedication behind the repeated calls suggested planning and intent. Whoever was responsible had spent time preparing, collecting phones, and figuring out how to maximize disruption. The town's sense of security, once unquestioned, began to erode. People whispered about the mysterious caller, anxiety spreading like wildfire. The 911 staff noticed something even stranger. Amid the static and repeated rings, there were subtle patterns. Certain calls seemed longer than others, and tiny, almost imperceptible sounds hid in the background. Was it random noise, or was someone trying to communicate something? The operators could not be sure, but instinct told them there was more beneath the surface than just annoyance. By nightfall, Cedarville was no longer just a peaceful town. It was a town on edge. Parents kept children close, drivers were cautious on the streets, and the police were on high alert. The day's ordinary rhythm had been shattered, replaced by the growing realization that a single individual had the power to turn normal life into chaos. The story of the 372 calls had begun, and no one in Cedarville would ever forget that fateful Tuesday. The morning after the relentless flood of 911 calls, Cedarville's police department launched a full-scale investigation. The sheer volume of calls had never been seen before, and officers were determined to track down the person responsible. Every phone line, every call log, and every digital trace was examined with painstaking attention. They traced the calls to a small, unassuming apartment on the outskirts of town. From the outside, the building appeared ordinary, even quiet, but the air around it felt heavy, as if it were hiding a secret. When officers entered the apartment, they found a scene that was both bizarre and unsettling. The living room was sparsely furnished, with a single chair in the center, facing a wall stacked with outdated phones, chargers, and tangled cords. On a small table, hundreds of notepads were scattered, each covered in strange scribbles and repeated phone numbers. Some sheets contained cryptic sequences of numbers that made no immediate sense, while others had symbols and doodles that seemed almost obsessive. There was no sign of the caller, no one in the apartment at all. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Authorities quickly realized this was not the work of a casual prankster. The level of preparation, the number of devices, and the organization suggested meticulous planning. It was clear that whoever had carried out the calls had been obsessively focused for days, if not weeks. Specialists began analyzing the background noise of the calls, hoping to uncover clues that might reveal the caller's identity or motives. What they discovered was chilling. Hidden within every fifth call was a faint whisper, barely audible, almost imperceptible, but it mentioned locations and times. At first it seemed like nonsense, random fragments of sound. As the day progressed, the whispers began to feel intentional. Investigators debated whether these were hints of real criminal activity or part of a disturbing game. The thought that someone could embed secret messages into repeated 911 calls unsettled everyone. It was not just an attack on the emergency system, it was psychological manipulation. Cedarville, a town that had never faced a threat like this, was now caught in a web of mystery and fear. The police began to suspect that the caller was highly intelligent and possibly socially isolated. Psychologists were consulted, and they suggested the man may have been motivated by a desire for control, using the town's emergency services as a stage to assert power. Every call, every interruption, was a way of demonstrating dominance without ever being physically present. The realization sent a shiver through the department. This was not just a prank. It was a carefully orchestrated experiment in chaos. Outside the investigation, the town felt the consequences. Ambulances were delayed, fire trucks rerouted, and minor emergencies went unattended for hours. Residents grew anxious, sharing rumors and speculations online. Social media lit up with theories, none of which brought reassurance. The very tools meant to protect the town had been turned against it, and no one knew if the situation would escalate further. The combination of preparation, secrecy, and strange coded whispers left authorities with more questions than answers. Was the caller planning a real crime, or was this elaborate harassment purely for control? Cedarville held its breath, waiting for the next move, while investigators struggled to decode a puzzle that seemed designed to stay one step ahead of them. What had started as a flood of calls was quickly turning into a psychological thriller, with the entire town as unwilling participants in a dangerous and unprecedented game. As the investigation into the relentless 911 calls progressed, authorities realized that understanding the man behind the chaos was as important as finding him. Psychologists and criminal behavior experts were brought in to analyze the pattern of calls and the strange whispers hidden within them. They concluded that the caller was likely highly intelligent but deeply obsessed with control. Each call was deliberate, calculated to frustrate and confuse the emergency system, testing its limits while keeping the public in a constant state of tension. It was not about causing physical harm, it was about exerting psychological dominance. The whispers within the calls continued to baffle experts. At first, they were dismissed as background noise, but closer analysis revealed subtle patterns, certain phrases repeated at specific intervals, almost like a code. Investigators speculated that they might contain hidden locations, times, or instructions. The possibility that these coded messages were pointing to real crimes or dangerous situations unsettled everyone. Cedarville had already been forced to confront delays in emergency response, but the idea that more serious threats could be imminent intensified the town's anxiety. Meanwhile, the residents of Cedarville were growing increasingly uneasy. Word spread quickly about the mysterious 911 spammer, and fear began to ripple through the community. Parents worried about leaving their children alone, Drivers hesitated at intersections, and people began double-checking doors and windows at night. Social media fueled speculation, with residents posting theories and wild guesses about the caller's identity. Each theory, whether rational or absurd, heightened the sense of unease. The psychological impact of one man's actions was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Police officers on duty reported feeling the pressure acutely. Every genuine emergency call became a high-stakes situation, as dispatchers struggled to differentiate between real threats and the repetitive 911 spam. The situation revealed vulnerabilities in the system, and the town began to understand just how much a single person could disrupt the delicate balance of public safety. Officers worked long hours, combing through logs and monitoring potential targets mentioned in the coded whispers, always fearing the worst. As the day wore on, the investigation took a chilling turn. One of the codes seemed to point to an address where a possible break-in could occur that night. Police quickly set up surveillance, unsure if it was a genuine threat or another trick designed to stretch their resources. The suspense was almost unbearable. Every shadow, every passing figure, could be the beginning of a real crime or just another false alarm. Cedarville, already a town on edge, now faced the unknown with heightened tension. Experts began to piece together a profile of the caller: socially isolated, obsessive, highly intelligent, and motivated by control and fear rather than violence. The calls were his way of orchestrating a scenario in which the town itself became part of his experiment. The realization was terrifying. This was not just a criminal act, it was a psychological game with an entire community as the unwitting participant. Cedarville had been forced into a nightmare, and the man responsible was still out there, hidden in plain sight, watching, calculating, and testing the limits of fear. The night that had been hinted at in the coded whispers finally arrived, and Cedarville was on edge. Police had surrounded the building mentioned in the calls, a quiet residential area where streetlights flickered intermittently. Officers crouched behind vehicles, radios whispering updates, hearts pounding as they waited for any sign of movement. Hours passed slowly, each second stretching into an eternity. The tension in the air was palpable. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. At first, there was nothing. The streets remained empty, the buildings silent. Officers began to question whether the warnings in the calls had been real or just another cruel manipulation. Had the caller anticipated this level of surveillance and intended to mislead them all along? Every rustle of leaves, every passing shadow was examined as a potential threat, keeping officers on edge. The suspense was maddening, and the frustration was building. Then, as dawn approached, a figure emerged from one of the buildings. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical resident, moving slowly with headphones covering his ears, carrying multiple phones. He was alone, calm, and utterly focused on his task. The police had prepared for a dangerous confrontation, but there was no aggression, no weapons, only a man surrounded by his tools of chaos. Within moments, he was arrested without resistance. The shock of the discovery rippled through the department. This was not the criminal mastermind they had imagined, but someone far more disturbing in a different way. Back at the man's apartment, investigators found the full extent of his obsession. Hundreds of phones, chargers, and wires were scattered across every surface, each one representing a part of his carefully orchestrated plan. Dozens of notebooks contained intricate records of calls, schedules, and codes. There was no sign of traditional criminal intent, no plans for robbery, no notes about physical attacks. The revelation was chilling. The entire operation had been designed to create chaos, fear, and disruption without causing direct harm. The man had spent weeks meticulously crafting a psychological experiment, testing the limits of both the emergency system and the patience of the town. Authorities realized that Cedarville had been caught in a carefully constructed web. Every delayed ambulance, every slowed police response, every anxious resident had been an unintended victim of his manipulation. The 372 calls had not just been a prank, they were a demonstration of power, a way for one person to control the reactions and emotions of an entire community from a distance. The discovery of his apartment and the organized nature of his work confirmed the calculated precision of his actions. In the aftermath, Cedarville began to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. There had been no physical violence, yet the emotional impact was undeniable. The town's sense of safety had been shattered, and the story of the 911 spammer became a chilling lesson in the power of psychological disruption. The man A.'s obsession with control and manipulation left a haunting reminder. Danger does not always announce itself with noise or force. Sometimes it creeps in silently, through static and repeated calls, turning an ordinary day into a living nightmare. Cedarville had survived, but the memory of that night, and the calculated chaos that led to it, would linger far longer than anyone had expected. In the weeks that followed the arrest, Cedarville struggled to return to normal. The town that had once moved at a steady, predictable pace now felt fragile, as though the events of that single day had left an invisible scar on everyone who lived there. Police officers worked overtime to restore confidence in the emergency system, installing new call tracing technology, updating protocols, and running simulations to prevent another mass spam attack. Residents were cautious, double-checking doors, locking windows, and watching the streets more carefully than ever before. The psychological impact of the 372 calls lingered, a constant reminder that chaos could erupt without warning. The man responsible faced a long list of charges. Beyond the obvious crimes of harassment and obstruction of emergency services, prosecutors argued that his actions had endangered lives, even if unintentionally. Ambulances had been delayed, fire trucks diverted, and legitimate emergencies had been slowed to a dangerous crawl. While no physical harm had occurred, the emotional and psychological strain on both the public and emergency workers was undeniable. The courtroom became another stage for the story of the Cedarville 911 spammer, and the man's obsessive behavior during the trial confirmed the calculated nature of his actions. Experts began studying the case closely. Psychologists labeled it a rare type of cyber-psychological crime, where the perpetrator's weapon was technology and manipulation rather than physical force. The man's motivation had been pure control, a desire to test the limits of an entire town's patience, fear, and reliance on its systems. In this sense, Cedarville had unwittingly participated in an experiment, one that demonstrated how a single individual, armed with focus and obsession, could create widespread panic without ever leaving their home. In the town, residents slowly tried to move forward. Schools implemented new safety drills, local businesses reviewed security procedures, and social media forums that had once thrived on speculation turned toward support and recovery. Yet despite these efforts, the memory of the event remained vivid. The sound of a ringing phone even now brought unease. The notion that someone could manipulate the normal functions of society from behind a screen was a lesson that hit harder than any physical crime. Cedarville had survived the day, but the experience had fundamentally altered the way the town viewed safety and trust. The story of the 372 calls became a cautionary tale, told and retold in news reports, online forums, and even classrooms studying criminal psychology. It revealed a truth that was hard to accept. Danger does not always announce itself with shouting, breaking glass, or weapons. Sometimes it comes quietly, invisibly, through repetition, strategy, and obsession. Cedarville's emergency systems were tested, its people frightened, but ultimately the town endured. The man who had orchestrated the chaos served as a stark reminder of human vulnerability and the power of psychological manipulation. In the end, Cedarville learned that fear could spread faster than fire, and control could be wielded without hands. The events of that single, extraordinary day left a lasting mark, shaping the town's approach to safety, technology, and trust for generations to come. It was a day that began with ordinary morning routines, and ended with a community shaken, alert, and forever changed. A day when one man's obsession became the story of an entire town.